ومعنا الأستاذ ماليشف، وهو رئيس قطاع السياسات التنظيميه بمنظمه التعاون الاقتصادي والتنميه، وهي منظمه تتشارك مع البنك الدولي ومؤسسات اخرى في متابعه المعايير الدوليه، وللمنظمه السبق في وضع عدد من المعايير الدوليه في مجالات الحوكمه، سواء الحوكمه على العموم، حوكمه عامه، او حوكمه الشركات. فليتفضل سيادته.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Fellow panelists, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, Assalamu alaikum. It's a real pleasure being here, and I'd like to thank the General Audit Bureau for inviting me to this important conference. I'm also very pleased that governance is the topic, not only of the conference itself, but also of Vision 2030. Governance is something that is very close to my heart and something that I've been working on for a number of years, seeing as that I'm in the Public Governance Directorate of the OECD. I do have to say that I feel like a little bit of an interloper here. I think I'm the only person on this panelist, and hopefully not the only person in the room, who is not an auditor. I'm an economist, a much maligned profession now, so I hope you take my words to heart. Obviously, given the focus or the importance of audit, the fact that financial management and control features so prominently in the Vision 2030 is rightly so. It's clearly a key component of public governance. But I'd like to argue in my brief intervention that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia also more carefully consider the stewardship of its laws and regulations, that it considers a little bit more carefully the governance of regulation, if you will. Regulation is a key instrument of government. It affects citizens, businesses, NGOs directly all the time, every day. The costs and benefits that it conveys to society, I would argue, probably are larger than the financial interventions that governments make. Therefore, getting laws and regulations right is really important in terms of being able to deliver on economic growth, on prosperity, and on protecting society more generally. So for over 20 years now, the OECD has been working on helping governments develop high-quality regulation and high-quality laws. And I'd like to describe that work in just a little bit of detail, but with an eye towards the main objectives of this conference, which is to try to come up with good governance approaches to administrative practices more generally. But before I talk about good regulatory practices, I think it's worthwhile reflecting on what is good regulation, what are governments ultimately trying to achieve through their legal interventions. And we've outlined a couple of issues which I think any government official needs to think about when they're drafting a law or regulation. First, does it clearly address a public policy problem? You don't want to regulate just for the sake of regulating. Does the intervention address that problem in a meaningful way to try to solve it? Is it based on clear objectives? Oftentimes, governments are required, some of the governments that I've worked with are required either to show that a regulation or a law provides net benefit to society, or that you make the intervention at the least cost. So again, there's some kind of clear objective in terms of how the government regulates. It's important that any intervention, any normative intervention, is proportional. Small problems need small regulations. Maybe they don't need any regulations at all. Maybe there's a way to self-regulate. But larger societal problems, issues around climate change, financial markets, immigration, might require big interventions that do actually convey significant costs onto society. It's important that any individual regulation or law fits into the body of law more generally. Oftentimes you see laws working against each other and at cross purposes. It's important that the law is understandable, that it's drafted in clear language so that citizens or businesses understand what's required of them. It's also important that it's clear that regulators and inspectors and enforcement agencies know how to implement the law. So again, clarity is really important. And also, obviously, you regulate in a very dynamic environment, so it's important to try to develop laws and regulations that stand the test of time, that are fit for purpose. So with those objectives in mind, we in the OECD have developed a set of what we call good regulatory practices. And these basically break down into 4 separate components. And again, I think all of these are relevant for the audit process and the implementation of a range of administrative practices. The first issue is that we feel that good regulation needs to be enshrined in a policy, and that policy ultimately needs to have legal effect. So the way governments should basically develop a law on laws, or they need to develop meta-regulation for how they intervene in the market and with society. Secondly, good regulatory practice and good administrative practice needs to be institutionalized. And there are a range of institutions that are part of the policymaking process. Obviously, ministries and policy agents work very far upstream in the design of regulations. Then further downstream, there are regulators, enforcement agencies, which actually deliver regulations. And at the end of the cycle, there's someone who monitors it, someone who evaluates whether these laws are addressing the issue at hand. In addition to that, we advocate for an oversight body, someone who has scrutiny over whether the process is working well in serving the public interest. So this is obviously a very rich landscape in terms of delivering on regulation. And the governance of this landscape obviously is a big challenge to meet. And we usually think of the governance in two terms, kind of the external governance, the whole of government governance of delivering on regulation or on any other policy intervention, and internal governance. And I think we've heard a number of what I'd sort of refer to as first best practices on external governance, and I won't go through those. But I would maybe argue for a little bit of caution in terms of how those might be implemented. I believe that sort of system-wide governance is highly contextual. It's based on your constitution, on your law, on your legal practices, on how the administration is organized, and more generally on the culture of the administration. So one needs to reform these, I think, carefully. And we've heard a lot of references to various indicators of governance. And I've certainly worked with countries that might rank 60, and they want to be 20. So they look at the practices of the number 20 country, and they say, oh, we're going to cut and paste some of those practices into our own system. Those types of reform, I would argue, are destined to fail. When it comes to the external governance of a system, it needs to be homegrown, needs to be done organically, done with caution, done with time. So again, I think this needs to be done internally and with care. I'd argue, however, that we've done a lot of work on the internal governance of individual units, of regulators, of financial audit bodies. And there, I think, the lessons maybe are a little bit clear. And we've developed quite a bit of research on this. And we've sort of identified 6 areas where you can improve your internal governance. And I think these hold across agencies and across countries. We've developed most of this research looking at economic regulators. But again, I'm curious in terms of whether this would be applicable for audit bodies as well. So those 6 criteria are, one is what we call role clarity, that the functions of the agency are clearly articulated in law. What your mandate is and how you discharge it is well defined by the law. Secondly, we believe that many regulators, audit bodies as well, need to have a level of independence. They need to be at arm's length from the political process so that you can carry out investigations, you can carry out implementing your mandate free from political interference. The third thing, but it's very closely related to this issue of independence, is that you're accountable to someone. You can't have independence without accountability. So the accountability, the lines of responsibility, your lines of reporting are clearly articulated in terms of who you are accountable to, oftentimes back to the parliament or the legislative body. Thirdly, we believe there are a number of good practices when it comes to the management of a regulator and probably an audit body, in that how the head of the body is chosen, how the commissioners are chosen, needs to be based on professionalism, shouldn't be based on partisanship or politics. And again, you want to have high quality, professional, competent people running the agency. The fifth thing is on the budget. Again, we think that budgets should be allocated on a multi-year basis and ultimately not be allocated from someone within the executive who might have discretion over your actions. For instance, we've done a lot of work with these energy regulators where the Ministry of Energy might be giving the energy regulator their budget, or the Ministry of Telecommunications is giving the telecoms regulator their budget. So again, that strongly limits their discretion. So again, where the budget comes from matters a lot on the governance. And finally, we believe that all agencies need to come up with a clear, understandable set of performance indicators. Again, that kind of goes back to your accountability. You know, how are you discharging your functions? How are you going to report on that? Is really key. So those are the 6 considerations of internal governance that I think probably are maybe not universally applied across government, but again, for agencies that need to operate at somewhat arm's length from the executive, we consider all of these to be really key issues. Moving on, I was going to talk a little bit about the administrative practices of regulation, but I won't in the interest of time. And I'd just like to conclude with what I see as a couple of challenges. And again, these are challenges for implementing good regulatory practice, but I think they're also central challenges for good administrative practices. One is how you avoid a box-ticking exercise. Many people in government see these kind of government or these accountability requirements as purely functional. Okay, so some of the practices in the regulatory areas, I have to prepare an impact statement. I have to consult with the public. And they do it purely from an administrative level, as opposed to realizing that doing this well actually will help decision making. It will help policy outcomes. So again, moving from what I'd call a box-ticking exercise to really embedding this into decision-making practice is a big challenge. Part of that challenge results from the lack of political buy-in in good regulatory practice or in many administrative practices more generally. Many ministers see these kinds of controls, these kinds of disciplines in terms of limiting their political discretion and mandates. So again, convincing them, getting them to buy into the fact that this will help them govern better is really central. And I think it's incumbent on us to develop products, communication strategies that meet their needs as policymakers. Oftentimes I see impact statements, evaluations that are hundreds of pages long. You know, is a minister going to read that? We did some research and we found that ministers tend not to read even a page of a document. Oftentimes they give up after 4 paragraphs. And generally, government officials more generally read between 6 and 8 pages of a document. You know, like I say, many of these are hundreds of pages of long. So clearly your communication strategy to ministers and to senior civil servants needs to be sharpened with sharp messages. That's how they might realize that these kinds of administrative practices actually do benefit them. Maybe I'll just conclude in the interest of time on the issue of evaluation. The vast majority of countries that I've worked with, when it comes to their regulation making, they focus on the upstream side. They spend a lot of resources on regulatory impact analysis while the regulation is being drafted, before it's actually implemented. Probably 80% of the good better regulation resources are done upstream. Very few governments really focus on evaluations, looking at whether laws and regulations are delivering good policy outcomes. And again, I think this is an area where there's a strong potential interface between the audit community and the regulatory community to use your good practices in terms of evaluating financial outcomes, fiscal outcomes, infusing that kind of discipline into the regulatory area. So again, I think there's a potential good mix to bring those two communities together. We're actually organizing a meeting in Portugal in June to do exactly that. Perhaps I could hope to welcome some of you there. But I'll leave it with that, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ ماليشف لتقديمكم الوجيز والسريع لهذه الأمور الهامة الخاصة بالمعايير الجديرة بالاتباع، وخاصة فيما أكدتم عليه بالنسبة للقواعد الخاصة بالحوكمة الداخلية، وتكمل ما بدأ به السادة المتحدثين في الجلسة بتركيزهم على الحوكمة الخارجية. ما أشرتم لي بالنسبة للاستقلال والمحاسبية، بعض حضراتكم طلع على مقال هام صدر أمس من محافظ البنك المركزي الإنجليزي بمناسبة مرور 20 سنة على بعض الإجراءات التي زادت من استقلال البنك المركزي في المملكة المتحدة وما ترتب على ذلك مسألة الاستقلال وما يترتب عليها. يعني هذه رؤية من الواقع. النصيحة، هناك عدة نصائح غالية فيما يرتبط بالتعامل مع المؤشرات وأهمية الارتقاء بالأداء داخليا وعدم التسرع في مجرد تحسين التصنيف، وأن يكون هناك جهد في عملية التطوير والتحسين بشكل متدرج، بالإضافة إلى إشاراتكم المتعددة للمستجدات في شأن الحوكمة سواء الحوكمة الداخلية أو الخارجية، ونشكركم على ذلك. وللأسف لا يوجد وقت للأسئلة، أعتذر من القاعة والسادة المشاركين فيها، علما بأني على علم بأنه السادة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة المشاركين في هذه الجلسة موجودين على مدار اليوم، وقد تسنح الفرصة ونتركها للسادة مدير الجلسات القادمة بإتاحة الفرصة لتوجيه أسئلة للمشاركين في هذه الجلسة. عند هذا أرجو من حضراتكم جميعا مشاركتي في تقديم التقدير لهذه المشاركة المتميزة من أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، معالي الشيخ بندر بن محمد آل ثاني، معالي الدكتور حارب بن سعيد العميمي، معالي الدكتور عابد بن عبد الحميد الخرابشة، ومعالي الدكتور بدران ابن عبد الرحمن العمر، والأستاذ نيك ماليشف على هذه المداخلات القيمة. والشكر والتقدير موصولين لمعالي الدكتور حسام وسعادة الدكتور صالح على التنظيم المتميز لهذا اللقاء، وشكرا جزيلا لحضراتكم.